1970s presentation topics. So we first start off with the Watergate scandal that we looked at in the Vietnam War section that led to Ford taking control of the presidency. Here we see the 1976 election, which leads to a victory for Jimmy Carter, become the president of the United States post Nixon, post Ford. Looking at the economy and inflation. So in the 1970s, you definitely are going to see an economic crisis that emerges, with regard to inflated prices just across the board. You also start to see labor union decline, as we could see in this particular trend. The yellow line for the private sector is headed downward. In 1977, we do see some payback, I guess, or social punishment for Nixon in the Frost-Nixon interviews, where he was interviewed by a talk show host, and he may or may not have admitted to the illegal bombings of Cambodia. Since there was no impeachment, no trial, the public felt that there was no accountability for Cambodian Vietnam actions committed by the Nixon administration, and this is the closest thing that we would get to some sort of accountability. We also see the gay rights movement starting to steam ahead with the Briggs Initiative in California, where they were trying to target teachers and public work employees and giving the label unfit for service for being an openly gay employee. And here we see Harvey Milk, one of the openly gay candidates in California, who was elected to office in San Francisco's Board of Supervisors, embarking on a series of debates challenging the Briggs Initiative. We also have a televised match in the Battle of the Sexes between Billie Jean King and Bobby Riggs, which again is starting to look at the barriers with regard to gender starting to change in the society that started in the civil rights movement. We also see some members of the Black Panther Party, as well as the Black Liberation Army, continue to be targeted by COUNTELPRO. And here we see one of their members being targeted, Asati Shakur, as it mentions right here. And we see the reward poster for her involvement in the murder of a state trooper. 1970s associated with poverty. Here we see an image of the South Bronx, the phrase "the Bronx is burning." We also start to see the trend of migration patterns from India starting to increase, as we can see the numbers increasing from 200,000 to 2 million. And that's a result of this Nationality Act being removed and allowing immigration. Soul Train, a show that aired on Saturday mornings, a show that featured dancing and music catering to a primarily African-American audience, which starts to expand into other areas in an attempt to go national. So it's just a component of Black culture. In the 1970s, we see the birth of disco. Some have argued that disco is considered gay tribal music. You can look at the lyrics of the songs like You Make Me Feel, I'm Coming Out, and so on. So here we see an image of Studio 54, which was a popular nightclub in New York City. If we click these links, it would take you to a protest for, I believe, the Disco Sucks movement. Let's see. Cocaine in the 1970s, labeled a controlled substance through the Controlled Substance Act, where they're really starting to crack down on the use of cocaine. Cocaine was considered a wealthy individual's drug because of its high cost, and we'll see how that impacts the 80s when people are able to take cocaine, mix it with baking soda, and come up with a new drug, crack, that allowed you to control the supply by increasing the supply, which would bring down cost. Dogtown and Z-Boys, this is about skateboarding. Apparently, you come to find out that in California, there was a water shortage that allowed surfers to, adapt to empty pools by dropping their skateboards in and popping back out in an artistic way. which led to an increase in skateboarding in the country. We see the birth of the self-esteem movement that would definitely impact millennials, where we start to see this idea where, we want to have positive self-esteem. Everybody gets a trophy, as we see this individual earning a trophy for fifth place. I guess it's an attempt to equalize. We'll see how that will impact the millennial generation. Video games are starting to increase as we see Pong, the birth of Atari, and kids hanging out at local arcades. But those arcades are starting to diminish as home consoles start to emerge. We also see Wozniak and Ronald Wayne working on one of the first mechanical forms of a computer that would eventually become a computer using microprocessors. And here we see this Apple computer in this wooden box. We also see in the 1970s the expansion of ARPANET. We talked about this in '68, where you had a series of computers hooked up to a network, and we see that more computers are being added, and this would eventually evolve to the internet. Disk memory used to store data. We can see the amount here and the massive size of these disks used to store data. We also see CB radios as a way for truckers to communicate. Why? Because there is an oil shortage, which is forcing the price of goods up, which is part of the reason why we have inflation. And the government is also going to implement a speed limit, a federal speed limit, which is going to force truckers to communicate with each other through a CB radio. So how would that work? You're speeding down the highway in your truck, and you pass a cop who is on the road trying to make sure that you are not speeding. You would then get on your CB and say, hey, I see a Smoky at mile marker 8. And that would let the truckers behind you know that there is a cop that is trying to pull you over here. So the oil crisis is also going to impact the way cars are made. If you remember in the 50s and 60s, we started to talk about the 8-cylinder engine that was extremely powerful, but not efficient. So we start to see the trend in the 70s where small cars are starting to be built, and all of those older cars that were used for speed, they're starting to get restrictions through catalytic converters and other emission controls to deal with their pollution that they send out through their exhaust pipes. 1970s, we see once again the birth of consumerism coming back similar to the way it was in the 20s. So I guess it's not the birth, where Americans are out shopping and trying to forget the problems in the Vietnam War and other issues in society. So we're substituting our problems with consumer goods. And of course, the mall, which becomes an institution that is gaining popularity in the 70s. And you could see the commentary of that in films like the zombie apocalypse movie, Dawn of the Dead, where the survivors barricade themselves in a mall as a way to forget about the zombie apocalypse. 1974, we see the Trade Center completed, Trade Center 1, Trade Center 2. And if you are not aware, Philippe Petit was a tightrope walker and attached a rope between the North and South Tower and walked across the two. We could also talk about George Willig, who actually walked up the Trade Center. He made these devices that locked into these lines and walked or scaled the building from the floor up. And we also have Owen Quinn, who just jumped off the building. And these three events made the Twin Towers a pop culture icon, where people started to appreciate the buildings as opposed to looking at them as a poor architectural design with no aesthetic value. We still have skyjackings taking place. Here we see Eastern Airlines shuttle. I just put in yellow. At the age of 16, we have a individual who tried to commit suicide and then decided after that he was going to hijack this plane. And so pretty much boards the flight with his .38 caliber revolver and tells the crew, just fly east until we run out of gas. So it doesn't seem to be any political agenda. The TV shows, All in the Family, The Brady Bunch, looking at the traditional nuclear family, which was a looking back at the 1950s. But then we see shows like All in the Family that involved a challenge between the left versus right, where you see Archie Bunker always arguing on the right, and his daughter and her husband, college students that would advocate for the left. So definitely was a show that talked about issues between the left and the right of the 1970s. That show, All of the Family. Encyclopedias, if you wanted to obtain information about any sort of issue. Yes, there was a time when you could not access this online. You could buy a set of encyclopedias from an encyclopedia salesman, and that individual would sell you these items, and then you would have a collection of heavy books. The Olympics, Munich Olympics. So this is over the terrorist organization Black September that wanted to put pressure on Israel to release terrorists by taking the Israeli Olympic team hostage in what becomes known as the Munich Olympics. This, of course, was one of the reasons why this organization, OPEC, which was a organization of Arab territories that wanted to put pressure on the global community to deal with issues impacting Arab states. And the way they went about doing that was using economic pressure by shortening the supply of oil. Why is this an issue? Because we've already addressed in the Cold War, there's tension between the state of Israel as well as surrounding Arab states that had attacked Israel several times. And by the time you get to the 1970s, all of these wars, Israel's attack, another war over here, they seem to fail militarily, which is why in the 1970s you start to see a series of terrorist attacks directed towards Israel, which puts the U.S. in a position where they have to try to broker peace between the sides fighting in the Camp David Accords. They're trying to make peace between Israel and, in this case, Egypt. You also have to remember that the United States is fighting in Vietnam up until 1975. We looked at the clip of U.S. soldiers leaving Vietnam by dumping their resources into the ocean as the United States withdrew from Indochina. We also see 3 Mile Island, where nuclear technology is being used to power a city, and 3 Mile Island, which was a nuclear disaster in Pennsylvania. Eventually, we see in Iran a hostage crisis, which again was addressed in the Cold War section, where Iranian students seized U.S. hostages at the embassy after Ayatollah Khomeini led a Islamic revolution in Iran. We should remember that we are still dealing with nuclear weapons in the 1970s. So you see the SALT I Treaty, where they're trying to reduce the amount of nuclear weapons, which was addressed in the Cold War. Also the busing incident in Boston, where Black students are being bused into white areas to integrate, which led to a protest in Boston known as the busing protest. In Ireland, we see yet another terrorist organization, the PIRA, that was trying to advocate on behalf of the people of Northern Ireland to try to remove them from the United Kingdom and unite Ireland into one. So the PIRA was a terrorist organization addressing issues in Ireland. And that's it for the 1970s. The 1970s definitely seems to be a huge turning point and a starting point for a lot of issues that are going to emerge later. For example, you will see some of the institutionalized racism, the silent starting to emerge and pick up. You'll start to see terrorism emerge. You start to see technology, changes with women, and so on. So definitely the 70s is an interesting time period coming out of the civil rights movement. That's it.